And our humble, meek pastor asked me to acknowledge publicly that I was wrong about the date and he was right. So show some affirmation to Pastor Chuck. April the 30th is right. So good. Well, we're so glad you're here. If you don't mind, if you're physically able to, I'd love to invite you to stand with us as we read our opening scripture today. As Pastor mentioned, as Rachel mentioned, we're starting a teaching through the book of Exodus. And several times a year, we just hammer out a book of the Bible. And both Pastor Zach and Pastor Chuck have been journeying through Exodus even before we talked about it. And it's one of those things that whenever people start the Bible, they typically start in Genesis, obviously at the beginning. And they sometimes don't realize that Genesis is like the prelude to get us ready for the story of what God's up to. And if you've been around the last several weeks, you know that God's been doing one thing since the beginning of time. We talked about it several weeks ago when we talked about the 4 covenants in the Old Testament. We talked about it when Annabeth Havner was with us and had our Seder meal. And so all of these things connect. And what's interesting is when you get to Exodus chapter 3, we meet Moses. Now, if you haven't read the story of Moses, how many of you have seen the movies with Moses? Yeah. And so what happens in Exodus chapter 3 is God shows up in a powerful way after Moses has blown it years before, after Moses now has spent 40 years in the desert where he's wondering, God, are you done with me? I don't know if you've ever been there, right? If you've ever been in that desert season that we sang about earlier. And what happens in Exodus 3 is after this extended time of Moses living in obscurity, God shows up. And I believe that there's some of us in this room this morning, some of us watching online, that you feel like you're on the backside of the desert, and today, God has a word for you. God has a word for me. Here's what it says in Exodus 3, starting in verse 1. It says, now Moses was pasturing the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, which I think is a funny name, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, this is the same mountain that's also called Sinai. We'll unpack. There's no way today I could do justice on all this, so keep coming back. Verse 2, then the angel of the Lord appeared to him. So this is God showing up in the Old Testament. It says, then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of the bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not being consumed. Verse 3, so Moses said, I must turn aside and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burning up. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside, almost as if when Moses was finally ready, when Moses was at this place of, hey, I'm ready to hear, God called to him from the midst of the bush, and he said, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. I'm thinking, no kidding, he's God, he knows that, right? Verse 5, then he said, do not come near. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place which you're standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Listen to verse 7. God says, I've certainly seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their outcry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering. So God's not distant. God knows that they've been in slavery. God knows they've been losing hope and losing heart. He says, verse 8, so I've come down to rescue them. And that's what we're going to look at all month long over these next 5 or 6 weeks. I've come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians, to bring them up from the land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. And then verse 10, and now come, I will send you. Heavenly Father, thank you for the power of your word today, for every single person that's been living in the desert, for every single person that's given up, for every person that's ever wondered if you want to use them. God, I pray that you'd speak so loud and so clear that they can't help but believe different because of you. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. And everyone said, amen. Amen. You may be seated. In this verse, God says, I will send you. And so if you're thinking about the book of Exodus, there's 40 chapters in the book of Exodus. And so if you want sort of a basic framework to think about it, is today when we meet them in chapter 3, they're in slavery in Egypt. Moses is in a place called Midian, and God is inviting him in this stage of the story to get started. Stage 3 that we'll come to weeks and weeks later is the promised land, right? That's what God's alluding to. This is what God promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that one day they'd have their own land flowing with milk and honey. It's going to be unbelievable. And so where we're going today, he's in Midian and he's at the place of starting. One day they're going to get to the promised land, which is the place of really surrendering to God. And in the middle, when you have like Pharaoh and you have the plagues and you have the Red Sea, that's what I call the stage of struggle, right? So today we're going to hang out in the place of starting. Ultimately, at the end of the series, we're going to get to the place of surrender. There's this whole messy middle called the season of struggling. And today we're going to focus on how do you get started. Do any of y'all have a friend that always has an excuse not to do something? Do you know that person? Anybody? How many of you are that person? Are you ever that person? Like when I'm in a good place, I'm pretty optimistic. Like when I'm in a good place and Chuck says, hey, we bought a car, now we need to figure out how to pay for it. When I'm in a good place, I'm like, that's awesome. When I'm tired, when I'm hangry, any of y'all get hangry? I'm a little less optimistic, you know what I'm saying? Like there's a lot of people that I know that they've got an excuse for everything. It's like they go on and on and on and on, and they go off, they get in Facebook rants and all the things, and then anytime somebody offers them a solution, they punch holes in it. They've got excuses. Isn't that true? Right? They've got excuses. Well, I could never do that. I mean, I could never the economy's so bad right now. I could never do that. Everybody's so, and on and on and on and on. They have excuse after excuse after excuse. Well, what I find when it comes to getting started with anything that matters, there's always going to be a fight. Anytime any of us say we want to go towards freedom, freedom, as you know, is never free, and freedom never comes without a fight. There's going to be a struggle. There's going to be a battle. And sometimes if we're not careful, we'll think that the fight means that we're not supposed to do it. Sometimes we think the fight is anytime there's any resistance, well, I guess it's not God's will. I guess it's not God's plan. I guess God doesn't want me to do this. I mean, if God wanted me to do it, he'd just make it happen, and it's easy. But instead, there's a fight. And the reason why there's a fight is not because it's the wrong thing for us to do, but oftentimes the reason why there's a fight is because the decision that God's calling you to make actually matters. Does that make sense? But when something doesn't matter, you don't need an excuse for it, right? When something doesn't matter, you don't need to come up with an excuse. But the moment there's a decision, there's a moment that there's a movement towards freedom, and that's different for all of us. When there's a moment that God's calling us to something great, there's gonna be a fight because what we're doing matters. What we're doing has weight on it. What we're doing has the ability of changing our lives and the rest of the lives around us. And what I wanted to look at today is I want to look at what does that fight look like? As we kick off the season and this teaching, what does that fight look like? Because what I think for all of us is the fight looks like a lot of excuses. So all I want to do this morning is I want to lift up the top 5 excuses that Moses had. The top 5 things that Moses would say when God says, I want to send you. I want you to do something great, because what I found in all the pastoral counseling we've done and all the kneecap to kneecap conversations at coffee places or at Mexican restaurants, these are the same 5 things that we struggle with. And the first one is this. Number 1, whenever it comes to this fight towards freedom, the first fight is what I would call, when we have excuse number 1, I am not good enough. Have you ever felt that excuse before? I'm not good enough. So God says to Moses, I'm going to send you, right? In chapter 3, verse 10, Moses, I've heard the outcry of my people. Moses, I know they've been in slavery for 450 years, and every year slavery is harder and harsher than the year before. And I know that they remember that I promised years and years ago to Father Abraham, who had many sons, and many sons had, I promised them that one day they're going to have freedom. But they feel like maybe God's forgotten. And Moses, I know you've been on the backside of the desert for 40 years. I'm going to send you. And instead of saying, oh God, that's such an honor. It's saying, God, I've been praying for this my whole life. I'm so excited. Let's get it done. Instead, here's what Moses says in chapter 3, verse 11. Moses responds to God and he says, but who am I? Who am I? Who am I to go to Pharaoh? And who am I that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? In other words, God, who am I? God, I'm not good enough. What's interesting about this is before Moses had been in the desert for 40 years, and before he was on the backside of nowhere, before he was shepherd, you know where he lived? He lived in Egypt. You know whose household he was part of? He was part of Pharaoh's household. He was a person that had everything you could ever want. If we met him 40 years earlier and God showed up and said, man, I'm going to send you, I'm going to use you, 40 years ago, Moses would have had swagger. 40 years ago, Moses would have been like, that's right, I'm God's man for the job. 40 years ago, there was this arrogance almost to him. There was this self-confidence in him. But now, 40 years on the backside of the desert, the first thing that Moses says is, God, I'm not good enough. And I just can't help but to wonder how many of us start there. I wonder how many times somebody like Pastor Chuck or Pastor Mao or any of our team or whoever you're reading or listening to, I wonder how many times somebody says, man, God's got a plan for your life. I wonder how many times somebody says, you do not want to miss God's best for your life. I wonder how many times you come into a door like this and you say, and you hear somebody say, man, God's going to use you to change the world. I wonder how many of us don't fight through this and we fall into excuse number one where we said, but I am not good enough. And I wonder how many times we're our own worst enemy. Does that make sense? I wonder how many times. I mean, I wish I had time to, I could tell you my story, right? I could tell you of what we call in business world a lot, imposter syndrome. Almost every leader I know on the planet, on the outside, people are like, oh, they got it all together. And on the inside, they're wondering, am I going to be found out? I mean, I've talked to you some parents. We've got baby dedication coming up in a few weeks. And anytime I talk to first-time parents, they're like, they actually let me go home with this baby and trust me, I'm going to keep it alive, right? I mean, who am I to do this? But if you're a note taker today, here's the response to that. Excuse number one is, I'm not good enough, but here's the refrain from God is, don't let the voice of your past be louder than the voice of your future. Don't let the voice of your past overshadow and be louder than the voice of your future, because when God looks at you, he doesn't say, I can't believe you, Moses. I can't believe you lost it 40 years ago. I can't believe you disqualified yourself. I can't believe. Instead, when God looks at Moses, he sees his future. He doesn't see him as he is. Instead, he sees him as he's going to be. And I just wonder if this morning, if we could get a little bit of a glimpse of how God sees you. When God looks down and he sees a forgiven you, he sees a person that's walking towards freedom. I wonder if God's saying, quit with the excuses. Excuse number one, I'm not good enough. Excuse number two is, I don't know enough. Excuse number two is, I don't know enough. And so as God continues to lean into Moses and said, Moses, I'm going to send you. Moses, I'm going to send you. I'm going to send you. It says in chapter 3, verse 13, then Moses said, behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, so Moses is like, hypothetically, if I go, and hypothetically, if I say, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, they may say in return. So he's playing out the scenario that doesn't even exist yet. They may say to me, what is his name? In other words, Moses is like, I don't know enough. God, if I go, they're going to ask me questions. God, they're going to stump me. God, how am I going to answer? I mean, they've got 450 years of pent up frustration and their dream is beginning to die. What if I don't know how to answer them? How many times do we feel that way? I mean, how many times have we started something and felt like we knew enough? I didn't know enough. When God picked me up from my ministry previous to bring me to Sugar Hill and be planted in this congregation, there's a lot of things I didn't know, right? I didn't know what it was like to lead a staff. 14 years ago, I didn't know, 14 years later, I'm going to lead 35 staff. 14 years ago, I didn't know I was going to get to serve with an amazing pastor and have somebody pouring me leadership skills. I didn't know that a couple years after I moved here, I'd be married to my wonderful wife. I did not know. There's a lot I didn't know. And if I had allowed what I did not know to stop me, I never would have said yes. And chances are you wouldn't either. I mean, if you waited till you knew everything there was about relationships, would you ever get married? If you knew everything there was to know about having a kid, would you ever have a kid? If you had to wait until you knew everything that you knew about your job, would you ever start the job? See, here's the truth. None of us don't know what we know until we're in a place of not knowing. That's a lot of words in one sentence. Are you tracking with me? You never know until you take that next step, right? So excuse number one, man, I'm not good enough. Excuse number two, man, I don't know enough. A couple weeks ago, I was at our next membership breakfast, and every time we host this, we have hosts in the room, people that have been members here for a while, just to say hello. And then if there's a question that somebody wants to ask that they don't want the pastor answer, they just want a real person answer. And one of the people in the room was Gigi Tucker, and she serves with our English as a second language ministry. And I'd never heard her talk about it. And so when I was talking about serving during our next membership class, she spoke up and talked about how every Monday night or every Wednesday night she's part of English as a second language. When we started this a little over a year ago, we thought 20 people were going to sign up. Now every Wednesday we have more than 100 people show up. And man, when Gigi started talking about it, she lit up and talked about the purpose and the fulfillment she's found through serving. If she waited till she knew Spanish, she would have never started. If she waited till she understood all the dynamics, she would have started. And so by stepping in, man, God's used her. So excuse number one, man, I'm not good enough. Excuse number two, I don't know enough. Excuse number three is I don't have enough influence or clout. I don't have enough influence. I mean, God picked somebody else. Listen to what he says in chapter 4, verse 1. Moses said, what if they don't believe me? What if they don't listen to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you. This is so crazy. Again, if you're to rewind 40 years before Moses was sent to the desert, if you're to rewind 40 years when he was still living in luxury in Pharaoh's palace, when you rewind 40 years when he had private tutors and he had access to the best education on the planet, if you're to rewind 40 years, Moses would have said, of course I'm the guy. Look at me, I'm good looking, I've got the best pedigree in all the land. I'm growing up basically as one of Pharaoh's sons, even though I'm not technically his son. I have access, I have leadership ability. If you were to ask him 40 years ago, he would have been, of course, I've got the influence. But now, 40 years later, he's wondering, God, you can't use me. People aren't going to listen. I just wonder how many times we do that same thing. I wonder how many times we disqualify ourselves before we even start. I remember growing up in student ministry. In student ministry, the people that had the most influence were typically the sports people. It's like, hey, let's get the captain of the football team. Hey, let's get the person that runs the fastest. Let's get somebody that looks like a model and all the things. And for me, I was a band nerd. Any other fellow band nerds in the house today? I was the drum major when I was in my senior year. So I had the stick and the hat and the feather that stuck out. Where are my band people? This is our moment. Where are our band people? Come on. You're not helping me. You're not helping me. Let's meet at 4 p.m. today and do a march around the parking lot. That'd be awesome. But a lot of times, for me, it was, well, God could never use me. I mean, God's just going to use extroverts with big personalities, and God's just going to use people that have sports ability. God can't use, here's how bad I was at sports growing up. I struck out at T-ball. I remember running the bases, and we had like an assistant coach yelling at me to stay on third base. We had another coach yelling at me to go all the way to home. And so I did what any good sport kid would do. I had a meltdown between third base and home. I need to sign up for Clear Path Counseling now that I think about it, because I'm still holding on to this. Moses is like, I don't have influence. But you know what God's more concerned about than influence? God's more concerned about your availability. He wants people that are available. Certainly he'll use whatever skill, talent, ability that you have, but more important than influence, God's looking for people that are available to say, God, I'm here. Where are your excuses today? I mean, for some of you, you've said these out loud. For some of you, you've felt them in your heart. Where are your excuses? Excuse number one is, man, I'm not good enough. Excuse number two is, I don't know enough. Excuse number three is, I don't have enough influence or clout. Excuse number four is, I don't have enough skills. I don't have enough skills. In chapter 4, verse 10, it says that Moses said to the Lord, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent. I've never been eloquent. So you're asking me to be your voice, your mouthpiece. You're asking me to be your spokesperson. But God, I've never been eloquent. Neither recently, nor in time past, nor since. You've spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and I am slow of tongue. God, there's no way you could use me. I mean, you're asking me to go talk to Pharaoh. God, I'm not quick on my feet. God, there's no way I have to think about what I'm going to say. And some people would say that maybe Moses had a stuttering problem or something like that. Moses is saying, God, you can't do that. And I wonder how many times we think our limitation is a barrier to God using us. I wonder how many times people would say, man, I've got something. Maybe it's a story from your past. Maybe you do have a history that if you could redo it, you'd do it differently. And so you're like, man, there's no way God could use me. Maybe you've got some other kind of challenge, an emotional challenge, a spiritual challenge, an emotional thing that's going on in your life. Yesterday, I was privileged to lead a funeral for a gentleman named Mr. Paul, who's passed away unexpectedly Wednesday morning, 74 years old. He was born without use of his voice. He was born with a bum arm. He basically lived all 74 years of his life as a kid. And as I heard the family telling the story, I was blown away. Nowhere in his story was, and he lived a reclusive life the rest of his life. Nowhere in his story was, did he sit back and blame the world or blame God. Nowhere along the way did he live this life where he was disconnected. Instead, his family empowered him. His family loved him so well and served him so well. They said anytime you saw Paul, he always had a smile on his face. And anytime you saw Paul, he always gave you that hug of welcome. And anytime you saw Paul, he would go out into the yard, he'd feed the birds every day. And his limitations didn't stop him. Even though he only had use of one hand, he learned how to do some carpentry, and he would hold the nail between his toes and he would hammer with the one hand that was able to. And for this gentleman, his limitations were not a limitation on God using his life. Your limitations are not God's limits. Does that make sense? I'm not good enough. I don't know enough. What if I don't have enough influence? I don't have enough skills. And here's the last one, excuse number 5. I don't feel worthy enough. I don't feel worthy enough. Here's the moment they've been waiting for. Here's the moment that God says, I'm going to remember the promise that I made. Here's the moment that says, God says, after 450 years of frustration, I'm going to do something great. And here's the best Moses can come up with. In verse 13, he says, please, Lord, now send the message by whomever you will. In other words, he's saying, send someone else but me. Anybody but me, God. God, use somebody. God, there's a big need out there. God, yes, we want you to rescue us from Egypt. And yes, we do want to go to the promised land, but use somebody besides me. Use my brother Aaron. Use somebody else. Anybody but me. I'm not worthy enough. When I think about my friends here at the church, I think there's a lot of us that wrestle with this. When we think about serving in kids ministry, I'm not worthy enough. I don't know enough. There's no way. Think about serving in our community. Well, what if I show up at Path United and they stump me? There's no way. I'm not worthy for that. Man, I can't go to Uvalde this week. I can't go to the Yucatan Peninsula. There's no way. I'm not worthy. Let me ask you a question. Who says you're not worthy? Who says? What makes them the authority on the matter? Nowhere in this story do you see God look at Moses and Moses, I had a great big plan for your life, but you blew it 40 years ago. Nowhere along the way does God look at Moses and say, well, you're right. My bad. I thought I was going to use you, but you don't know enough and you don't have enough clout. And nowhere does God say any of those things. Instead, God looks at Moses and says, I am sending you. Let me ask you a question. Which of these is your excuse? And let me ask you this question. What if you're wrong? What if you're wrong? Let me challenge your assumption for a minute. What if that story you're telling yourself is not true? What if you're wrong? And so often when we're fighting the fight towards freedom, we believe every story in our head. And I just want to tell you, not everything you think is actually true. Because here's the reminder to Moses. God says, I'm going with you. I'm going with you. He doesn't say to Moses, hey, good luck with that. I hope you have a great time in Egypt. Hey, I'm going to send all these, good luck. I hope you figure it out. The promise to Moses is the same promise to you, that God is with you. When did Moses get qualified? When was Moses qualified to do this? I would say the moment that God called him. It wasn't his education. It wasn't his influence. It wasn't his skill. It wasn't his eloquence of speech. The thing that qualified him was that God said, I am sending you. And the one thing that overcomes every single one of these excuses, the one thing that overcomes, I don't know enough, I'm not good enough, I don't have enough influence, I don't have enough ability, what am I going to do? The one thing that overcomes every single excuse is this one thing that God wants from you and from me. The one thing God wants is obedience. It's obedience. Moses could have stayed there and said, but God, I'm not convinced. He could have sat in his theoretical row and say, yeah, somebody else ought to do that. But instead, here's what it says in chapter 4, verse 20. It says, so Moses took his wife, Moses took his sons, and he returned to Egypt. In other words, he did the next right thing God asked him to do. He didn't know all the things about the plagues. He didn't know in the next chapter about the rod that's going to turn into a snake. He didn't. I guarantee you, he did not know all that he was going to face. But what he did know is God called me, and I'm going to be obedient. I'm going to be obedient. I'm going to do the next right thing. And so by the time we get to the end of Exodus and you start reading Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, when you get to Deuteronomy 5 and Moses is big and bold and say, the Lord your God is one God, we will worship him only. After this journey towards freedom, Moses was a different person. Chapter 3, he's scared. Chapter 3, he feels disqualified. By Deuteronomy, he's seen the power of what a simple yes can produce. Yeah, I'm not good enough. But when I put my faith in Jesus, it's not my goodness, it's his that God's looking at. Yeah, I don't know enough, man. There's a lot I don't know. But when we get Jesus right? When we put our faith and trust in Jesus, that's enough to know. Does that make sense? And yeah, I don't have enough influence. I'm just a band geek. I was never a jock. I was a strap. I was not an... They're terrible. I was never an athlete, an athletic supporter. But anyway, you know what? That's terrible. That's one of my friends' jokes, and I'll tell them y'all's response. Jesus is our source of influence. I don't have enough skills. Jesus is our source. I don't feel worthy. Jesus makes us worthy when he dies on the cross and comes back to life. And so my question for you is, what is your excuse? And are you willing to replace your excuse with a simple yes? I may not know what all this means. I may not know all that I'm going to face, but as best as I can, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to be obedient to the next thing, because the one thing that overcomes these excuses is not our ability, not our intellect, not our influence. It's saying yes. Can I pray for you this morning? Would you bow your heads for a moment? Would you close your eyes? The team's going to come back out. And before we head out, man, I want us to sit with this thought. Is there anybody here in the house today that would just say, Bobby, as you pray for me, as you pray for me, because honestly, I've got some of those excuses running through my head and my heart. Maybe you've not articulated them exactly the way that I have today, but you would just say, man, I felt disqualified. I felt unworthy, and I felt like there's no way God could use me. And you just be honest and say, Pastor, would you pray for me? Would you pray that I would not allow my excuses to get in the way of what God wants to do? If that's you and you'd allow me to pray for you, would you just quietly slip your hand straight up in the air, straight up in the air? Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. You can put your hands down. Let me ask the second question. Is there anybody this morning that would just say, Bobby, as you pray for me that I would have courage to be obedient? Maybe you already know what that is. Maybe there's something that God's been tapping on your heart about, saying, I want you to take this next step. Maybe you already know it, and you've honestly been like I've been in the past, just scared to take that next step. And you say, pray that I'd have courage. Maybe for others, you don't know exactly what that is, but you know that there is one. You say, pray that I have courage. If that's you, would you do the same thing? Just slip your hand straight up in the air, straight up in the air. Would you pray for me that I would have courage? Because before we can be confident, it starts with courage. One last question. Is there anybody this morning that would say, Bobby, pray for me? I don't know Jesus like that. I need Jesus to be my source. I need Jesus to be my theology. I need Jesus to be my Savior, my Lord. If that's you and you'd allow me to pray for you, would you do the same thing and slip your hand straight up in the air? Yeah. 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 If that's you, I'm going to pray out loud. I invite you to pray in your hearts with me. There's nothing magical about the words. What's powerful is the heart behind it. In a similar way, it's the heart behind Moses, the heart behind us to say, Dear Jesus, I know I'm a sinner, and I believe my sin has separated me from you. But I know that you died on the cross for my sins, and I believe you're alive today. And as best as I know how, I ask you to step out of heaven and into my heart and save me. Rescue me. Help me to live for you. If you prayed that part of the prayer with me, Pastor Chuck, myself, some of our team will be available. We'd love to know that. Or if you're watching online, you can drop us a note at next@sugarhillchurch.com. We'd love to help you take next steps. If you're a believer today and you've got excuses, maybe you want to pray this part of the prayer with me. Dear Jesus, help me to quit making excuses. Help me to quit disqualifying myself from the thing that you've called me to do. God, would you help me to be obedient to whatever's next? Help me to start with yes. And Father, I pray for our friends today that you would give all of us, myself included, courage to take out that next step. Father, help us to fight for freedom. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Let's stand together. Before you head out, Pastor Zach and the team's going to lead us. We love you guys. Don't miss next week. Pastor Chuck is back in the pulpit with part 2 of this. It's going to be an incredible journey. Let's sing this out before